So this morning we have the pleasure of hearing from Julia Wise from the Centre for Effective Altruism. In her role at the Centre for Effective Altruism, Julia serves as the contact person for the worldwide effective altruism community, as well as helping local groups to support their members. She also serves on the board of GiveWell and is the president of Giving What We Can, a global community of over 4,000 people who've pledged to donate at least 10% of their lifelong income to effective charities. Before joining CEA and Giving What We Can, Julia worked as a social worker, assisting prison inmates, psychiatric patients, and refugees. She holds degrees in social work and sociology. Please join me in welcoming Julia Wise.
Thank you. So, a main focus of my work at the Center for Effective Altruism is trying to support the community in various ways. And since the focus of this talk is around sort of having a more welcoming and healthy community, the specific example that I'm going to use of that is diversity. I think that that's one aspect of a healthy community, and it's one that brings out a lot of the elements of what really makes for a healthy and welcoming community. So that's the main focus of this talk today. And I'll start with sort of a navigation metaphor for this talk. So we're going to think about where do we want to be, where are we trying to get as a community, where are we now, how did we get to where we are now, and how do we get where we're trying to go, to a healthier version of EA. So what is it that we're trying to achieve as a community? What would we like to be as a community? So we want EA to be a welcoming space for anyone who is interested in doing good more effectively. And that's not everyone. So my sister, for example, has zero interest in effectiveness or the kinds of projects that EA is about. And that's fine. EA's approach is not appealing to everyone. And I think we don't have to force it on people who aren't interested in the project of sort of using evidence and reason to do more good. But for people who do find that EA resonates with them, we want them to feel welcomed. We want them to feel that there is a place for them. And once people are in the community, we want them to be having a good experience so that they can do their best, participate fully, and make the change in the world that they want to make. So that's where we're trying to get. Where are we now? I'll, again, go to the sort of the demographic element and speak about sort of where we are statistically. So the EA survey collects data each year about various aspects of the EA community, one of which is demographics. On the question about race, when people fill that out, I recognize that the categories used by the EA survey are not the categories that, the terms that are used everywhere. But 89% of the EAs filling out the survey identify as white, 7% identify as Asian, 3% as Hispanic, and 1% as Black. Obviously, that's not at all representative of the global population. I looked at the numbers for Australia specifically, and in Australia, EAs identify as around 90% white, 8% Asian, 2% Hispanic. There were 0 attendees, or people filling out the survey who identified as Black in Australia on the EA survey. As far as gender, 67% identify as male, this is globally, 29% as female, and 4% as something else or didn't want to answer. In Australia, the balance is more even. Here we go. We've got 55% male, 42% female, and 2% other. So Australia is doing better on gender balance than the EA community worldwide. I'd be interested in the questions if you have ideas about what may be going on there, what the rest of the EA community could learn from Australian EAs. And on the racial balance also, because Australia is a heavily white country demographically, those demographics are actually fairly similar to Australia overall compared to worldwide EA, which is more skewed from the baseline population. So those are kind of the statistics. But I think what matters is, not just the statistics, but what are people's experiences, what's going on sort of on the ground. And I wonder, how did we get to the kinds of imbalances that we see demographically in the community? So, why is EA not already more diverse? I think that's the question about how did we get here. So, one of the most obvious reasons that I think we can guess at is what you might call founder effect. That's a term from biology that describes what happens when you get a relatively small number of individuals starting a population, which then ends up with limited genetic variety. And I think sociologically, a similar thing happens when you have a small, narrow demographic starting a movement or a community. And so in EA, you see a fairly small group of young, white, English-speaking men in a few fields like philosophy and computer science who really kind of got some of these early organizations going. And if people recruit their friends, and if their friends resemble them demographically, then without conscious effort, a community will tend to stay in the same demographic that it started in. And I think if that's what happened in EA, you would expect to see demographics roughly like what we have now. So again, without conscious effort to change that, I think that it is possible to change it with conscious effort. I'll give another example of why I think we might have ended up in the place that we are currently, with thanks to Alex Gordon Brown for pointing this out. So the mathematician Thomas Schelling made an example of sort of how segregation might work. And he did this by laying out pieces on a game board. You have two colored pieces, and you scatter them randomly across a game board. And then you give each piece a preference for not being heavily outnumbered. So let's say that each color has a preference for not being outnumbered more than 2 to 1. By pieces of the other color. And if it is outnumbered 2 to 1 or more, then it will move to the nearest space where that's not the case. So it's not even a strong preference for homogeneity or segregation. It's what we might consider fairly mild. And yet, it leads you to some, even at fairly low levels of preference for sameness, it leads you to quite a lot of clustering. And the stronger the preference for sameness is, the stronger the level of segregation that you see. So if people work something like that, if people feel more comfortable being around people who resemble them in some way, if that's more familiar, then you would expect to see people, even without trying to segregate into different cause areas, different races, et cetera, you would expect that this might happen even without people actively intending it. And certainly if they do actively intend it, then it happens even more. So I also want to talk about, I've actually moved a little closer to slides, but I want to talk about who chooses what problems to work on. And EA really emphasizes this very abstract approach where you're meant to sort of zoom out, be cause neutral, assess all the problems in the world from a neutral standpoint, weigh the pros and cons, and only then decide what problems to work on. And I think that is easier to do for people who are not immediately pressed by a problem that is personally affecting them or people close to them. But if you are personally affected by a problem like racism or poverty or anything else, if that problem is staring you in the face or is affecting people that are close to you and that you care about, then you don't even need to zoom out before you find an important problem to work on. It's right there. And so that may be much more compelling to you to work on, and that may also be where your comparative advantage lies, because you may have more knowledge of the situation and be better able to address it. And so I think it's not surprising that people may have a different approach to problem selection depending on how personally affected they are by a problem. Another aspect I want to think about is what is it like to be in an environment where there are not a lot of people like you? And some of that is how many negative experiences have you had? So I think when negative experiences along any axis happen to you pretty rarely, it is easier to brush them off. It's easy to say, well, that wasn't a great experience, but it so seldom happens to me. It's not a big deal. Whereas if these kinds of problems happen for you on a regular basis, if there is a pileup and an accumulation of these negative experiences, whether those experiences come from honest mistakes or from ignorance or from outright discrimination, it bears a heavier cost on you. And when one more negative experience piles on top of that stack, you may be more likely to say, I've had enough, I'm out of here. So it feels very different to people who are kind of walking around with that accumulation than to people who are sort of freer from that burden. And this doesn't just apply to sort of the more obvious categories like race and gender. I think it also applies to people who for many reasons, may feel like outsiders in effective altruism. Older people, people who have served in the military, people who are parents, people who didn't grow up with a lot of money, people who still don't have a lot of money, people who are interested in a cause area that their friends are not interested in, people who didn't find an amazing EA job. I think these are all things that can affect whether people feel included in EA, whether they feel like there's a space for them that's easy to fit into. And an EA that is not welcoming to people in those groups is missing out on a lot of potential. I think we can't afford to do that. Another reason that people might consider EA sort of a bad fit with their personal lives is this idea that EA has to be the only important thing in life. I see that idea especially in people who are taking EA really seriously and getting very intense about it, and I think that intensity can be very motivating, but I also see it as really risky when people sort of come to the conclusion that that means you have to cut other things out of your life. I think a social movement that asks you to cut everything else out of your life should raise some red flags, and you should be very worried if any movement is asking you to do that. So when you make important decisions in your life, I hope you consider your values and make decisions that are in line with your values. But we all value things that are not optimizing for global utility. That's how humans work. And I think denying that is just not a realistic way to make decisions or to go through life. So, for example, when I'm with my children, I'm not trying to optimize for global anything. I'm trying to be a good parent. Those are different projects, and it's fine to have different projects that you value in your life. EA should not be the only thing. And if we treat EA as incompatible with caring about multiple things, we exclude people who have things that they need to take care of, like families or a health problem that take some of their attention and resources. And if we, again, miss out on those people, we're missing out on a lot. So I've given some reasons why I think EA has become as homogenous as it is, or has the skews that it has. And I want to say more about why is that a problem. I pointed at some reasons. And the first reason is that it reduces our impact. We're trying to change problems that are not narrow problems. They are problems that affect large, portions of the world. And to do that, we can't just function with a narrow slice of who's out there. We need a lot of different approaches, a lot of different knowledge and experience. So to give an example, animal advocacy is really trying to expand in Asia because so many animals are raised there. And to do that work effectively requires people who know what the scene is like on the ground, who are familiar with the institutions, the culture, et cetera, that you need to do that work effectively. And some EA organizations haven't been able to hire as many staff as they would like, and it would be great if our community had a more diverse pool that could be sort of providing new talent for those kinds of projects. Likewise, anything involving global catastrophic risks, those are not problems that involve only one national or cultural group. They need people who have backgrounds in a lot of different areas, both skill-wise and culturally, to have the kind of coordination that we desperately need. So that's the impact side of things. The other side is, what are people's experience like? We want people to have good experiences in EA. We want people to have more good things and fewer bad things in their life. That's kind of the point of EA. And that applies to people within the movement as well as externally. So we don't want people to feel that they're not being valued, that they're not included, or that they're being only included for superficial reasons or tokenized, or that they're isolated from other people who are like them and people don't really get them. And then third, staying in a narrow demographic locks us in and limits our potential as a movement. I think if people who would bring a lot of talent and who have a lot of potential to do great work look at EA and they say, that's not for people like me. I don't feel like I have a space there. We've lost out. And I think we don't want people to look at EA, see how narrow the demographics are, and decide they don't want to find out why that is, why there are so few people like them. I'm going to give a caveat about the existing diversity that is here. When I first started thinking about this topic, I wrote a blog post called "Where Are the Women?" About the gender skew in EA. And afterwards, a friend who helped found one of the EA organizations said, what am I, invisible? Am I not here? Am I not contributing? And I don't want to make that mistake again. I don't want to erase the many EAs from many backgrounds who are contributing, and I want to express my gratitude to everything that people from all backgrounds have brought and are bringing to EA. So I've outlined some problems. Now we're going to start talking about solutions. How do we get closer to where we want to be? And my sort of caveat is that a lot of these ideas are fairly complicated. Different people have written a lot about this topic, and I've put some links to existing articles that have been written by different people in EA in the comments on this event. So if you look at it in your app, I've linked to some of the articles that I think really do a good job at addressing some of the steps. I think often it's not simple recommendations. If I could recommend 5 things that would totally fix this problem, we would have solved it by now. So for further reading, I would definitely recommend. But here are my kind of top suggestions. First is just getting to know each other, especially if you're from a group that is overrepresented in EA, or at least well represented in EA. Try to get to know people who are from less represented groups. Try to be in friendships, learn about what they're interested in. Just step outside your comfort zone a little more. Another way to kind of amplify the diversity that we have is choosing examples. When you are giving examples of EAs who have worked on a certain problem. When you are writing about people working on different projects, things like this. When you're speaking to other people, when you're, I didn't actually have a thing to say there. Portraying EA in a way that represents some of the diversity that already is here, rather than the sort of usual suspects every time. Notice when you're using jargon. I don't want to say we can't use jargon. I think it can be really helpful. It's a way of conveying complicated ideas, quickly, and it can be good as long as people understand what it is that you're talking about. And if people aren't familiar with the jargon, then it just serves to build barriers. So when you're in a conversation of people who might not all know the jargon that you're using, which could even just be experienced EAs from a different place. The jargon varies, by different sort of interest and by geographic area. So try and bring them into the conversation by explaining, what is it that I mean by this acronym? What is this term that I'm using? Who is this person that I just referred to? So bringing people in to where they can, be fully part of the conversation, especially if they're newer. When thinking of people to have involved in projects. So whether that's in your local group, running conferences like this, running various other projects, try and brainstorm people that you wouldn't normally think of. So it's easy to think primarily of people who are already kind of in your social group, but setting aside time to think about people who are not already in your current social group. So for example, for brainstorming who could be another organizer of your local group, who could give some kind of presentation or a lightning talk or facilitate a discussion. Really setting aside some brain power to think about people from underrepresented groups rather than sort of defaulting to familiar faces. And if you're a person from an underrepresented group, I know you may get a lot of requests to kind of be that represented face. Maybe you're not, but you should be. So I hope that there are opportunities for you to be more visible, to take some steps to maybe facilitate a discussion, maybe write an article on the EA forum, and be visible to people who are looking around to see, are there people like me represented in this movement? We need you, and we really appreciate it when you are in more visible roles. And just generally kind of try and build each other up and support each other. I think we can get kind of pedantic and snarky sometimes. Try and rein it in. Remember that we're all here because we care deeply about trying to improve the world. We can collaborate on those projects and really try and support each other. So if we do all that, will it work? Will our demographics get to mirror the demographics of the societies we live in? I don't know. But to use an example, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I think if we build an EA culture that is friendlier and more welcoming and more compassionate, and where people help to support each other and include each other, even if it doesn't change the demographics, I will consider that a good thing. So I'm going to end with 2 requests. One is, when talking about this topic, recognize that feelings run high. Be careful and kind with each other. I hear from people who are scared to discuss this topic because they know how high the tensions can run or how strongly people feel about it. They're afraid about people kind of getting angry with each other. I've also seen conversations go really well where people are careful and compassionate and are curious about each other's experiences and why it is that someone has a different viewpoint. And I think that's the kind of conversation that can bring us forward as a group. And the second request is, don't give up. This is not an easy problem, but luckily EA attracts people who are interested in hard problems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Julia, for that really wonderful talk. Like you say, it's not an easy problem, but I'm personally really thankful that there's people like you who are working on this and thinking about these sorts of problems. So we do have a bit of time for questions. We've got until 10:30. So if you do have any questions for Julia, please submit them via the Hoover app. I see a hand there. Are you wanting to ask a question but you're not able to use the app? Is that? Sorry? Okay, great. Yeah, well, I'll be looking through them and we'll see how many we get through to. Given I have the power of the microphone, I'm going to use that to ask the first question. So Julia, do you have any concrete examples of things you've seen happening either in local groups or in EA organisations that you think have worked really well towards creating a more diverse community?
One example that comes to mind is one that I heard of just a couple of days ago. I was talking to someone who's written a series of articles. He's a male EA who was writing a series of articles about different topics in EA, and 2 of them were about individuals in EA. They were profiles. And he didn't say anything about how he selected the people, but I noticed they were both female academics. He had written profiles of Eva Vault and Hilary Graves. And I loved that was, who he selected to kind of amplify their voices and bring more attention to them. So I think people who are choosing, who to write about or to, invite as speakers and so forth. I've seen a lot of attention within EA to trying to kind of break the usual patterns of how we kind of just select the people that first come to mind. And yeah, trying to change the pattern of who is represented. Yeah, that's one example that comes to mind. And I think, another example that comes to my mind is the first EA meetup that I went to after my daughter was born. I had this sort of fussy baby with me, and the organizer was an undergraduate who kind of, I think, had not thought a lot about like, what is it like to be a new mom at it, in an EA context that's mostly made of male undergraduates. And he's sort of like, oh, look, your baby. Oh, he's talking a lot about the baby, et cetera. And I sort of felt like, oh, is this who I'm going to be now? I'm just going to be like an appendage of a baby. And my friend who was there as the sort of guest speaker, and who was also, a big fan of said baby privately, said nothing about, my sort of new parenthood or anything like that. He just asked about, well, Julia, what do you think about, this topic in global development? He only asked questions about my knowledge, and made me feel like part of the conversation again as a a person with a brain and not just with a child. And so that's another example of a case I remember where someone was paying attention to the gender dynamic, and kind of realizing what I might be feeling like and how I might be feeling marginalized at that time, and trying to counteract it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I guess it's also good to have a reminder of how you can have your own blind spots as well. Like, for example, myself, I'm interested in women's role in EA, but not being a parent, I think I forget about that aspect, which is a big issue for a lot of women. The demands of motherhood and the way that society can put restraints on that. So a couple more questions. So many forms of diversity are not visible, such as mental health, socioeconomic background, education, religious belief, etc. What's the best way to be inclusive of these forms of diversity when they are generally a lot harder to observe?
I think there are cultural assumptions that we all make about, oh, well, of course we all sort of, have this belief. And I hear people sometimes casually talking about like, oh, well, of course, if you were religious, then you would disagree with this EA idea or something like that. When that's not necessarily the case. I think there are, people of faith who have, very complex ways of relating to EA and varied ways of relating to EA, and to boil them down to like, oh, well, of course, religious people are like that, it is just unfair and inaccurate. And I think there are other parallels to that in terms of, well, if someone, didn't go to a top university, then they're probably not, interested in these careers or something like that. And I think trying to remember the breadth of who is present in an EEA and who is interested in the project of doing good effectively for many reasons. It's not that everyone is a hard-boiled utilitarian. So even assumptions about people's philosophical beliefs or something, I think just make sort of needless narrowing of who is considered to be in EA. And I think, again, trying to kind of broaden the range of people and have really talked to about things. So I think, like, for me, having talked to EAs who come to this with a religious perspective, or who come from a background where their career prospects are different, because they didn't go to a top university. I mean, I didn't go to an especially fancy university, but being able to sort of have those people as real people in my mind, and not just as sort of vague possibilities. I can sort of think, well, what would Dominic think about that? Or, what would Coralie think about that? And I think that helps me sort of have things like actually, play out in my mind more than being something that's hard to even remember.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of people have asked about, and this is a little bit related to this question, but about how effective altruism can be, I guess, more welcoming to people of different educational backgrounds and different levels of education. And is that something you've got some thoughts on?
I do. Maybe I'll give a personal story. When I was studying social work, because I really loved the topic of mental health, I loved working face-to-face with people. And at the time, the emphasis in EA was all about sort of earning to give. This was sort of earlier days when everyone was talking about how can you become a banker, how can you, earn the most money possible in these high-flying careers so that you can donate lots of money. And I thought, man, what a loser I am to be focusing on social work, and I'm not going to earn much money. I'm in this program with people who really care about individuals but don't care about effectiveness, and am I just a terrible EA for making this life decision? And I thought about should I go to medical school or should I do these things, and I just couldn't see it working for me. And I really loved social work, and I continued with it. And over time, EA recognized, a movement composed only of bankers would have some problems, and we need some people, who have experience working with individuals, who have experience thinking about what people's needs are as humans and not just as money makers. So I was really grateful that I stayed in that field, and that those skills ended up being useful in EA. And likewise, I think in community organizing is a real need, and I think I worked as a cook before social work school, and so the fact that 40 people can come over to my apartment and I know how to serve a crowd, that's something you don't learn in grad school unless you go to culinary school, I guess. But I think there's so many skills that people can bring to EA. Whether it's sort of how to really communicate with people in a sort of common sense way and explain things in ways that sort of make sense to an audience in a way that can maybe be actively harder if you have studied them in sort of academic ways. Or to organize and facilitate events, things like that. Those are skills that don't require high degrees or high earning careers or anything like that. I think those are skills that we really need.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've given a very good case for, I guess, a lot of the benefits of diversity and the value of diversity. I've got a question here asking about whether there will sometimes be a trade-off between harnessing those values and that goodness of diversity and targeting people who have specific skill sets or areas of expertise that people might think are especially important in the community. Is that a tension that you see, and do you think it's a real tension?
I think it's not as much of a tension as people are worried about. I think, like other people, when highly skilled people look at a community, often they kind of want to know, well, what is this community like? Is it composed of jerks? Like, what, are they nice people? What are they like? Do I want to spend time there? Do I want to collaborate with them on projects? And I think there are elements of, being welcoming to lots of different kinds of people that people really pick up on pretty quickly, and often use that, I think, in deciding, is this a group that I feel good about being part of? Or is it so exclusive that it's sort of off-putting even to the people who can sort of make it past the barriers? I think that's a real dynamic, and I think just the feeling that we need to be, sort of erect these fences or something to sort of like be appealing to the high flyers. I'm just not confident that that's how it actually works.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So we've got a question here about whether you know of examples or have an idea or a sense of how many people we might be missing out of because of not being a very diverse or welcoming as we could be community. Do you have a sense of that?
I don't think I have any numeric sense of it. I think it's hard to get an intuitive sense because the people who quietly decide this is not for them and back away are harder to notice than the people who are still here. I do think there's interest in collecting more information about this. So, I've been at an event last year where everyone was asked to think of someone they knew who used to be interested in EA and has stopped being interested in EA, and then trying to follow up with those people about what was it that caused you to decide this was not for you? And I believe the EA survey might be considering, collecting some data of that kind as well. So I think it's the kind of thing that needs a conscious effort again. As with many of these problems, if we sort of just glide along in the easiest way, we don't notice important things, and it takes some effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just a reminder for a plug for the EA survey. So if you haven't filled it out and you feel like you're somebody who's quite involved in effective altruism, please fill that out so that we have data on things like this and can make progress. Well, we might just stick to the questions, and because without the microphone it gets a little bit tricky as well. And we do only have time for one more question. So, and I think this is a good one to finish on. Julia, how do you see the effective altruism community being in 5 years? And I guess maybe you can give a realistic assessment and also maybe an aspirational assessment as well of how you would like to see the community.
I have seen EA get broader in focus, say, over the last 5 years. As I said, when I was in grad school, it was kind of, earn to give or nothing was the emphasis. And I've been pleased to see that broaden out. And I've been pleased to see us recognize that we need sort of a portfolio approach of careers. We're not just trying to recruit, technical experts in AI risk or something like that, we need people who think about policy. We need people who think about community building. We need people who think about, how to do work in different countries. And I hope, and I think that's a realistic hope, that trend will continue and that we will build this movement to be, to have a broader portfolio of people with different skills and different backgrounds. The degree to which that happens is more, it's harder to guess at, but I do think that that's a realistic expectation that we will continue recognizing how much we need people from different backgrounds. And if we can sort of maintain the parts and strengthen the parts of our culture that are really friendly and welcoming, and that genuinely appreciate what people bring, rather than sort of only trying to tick the boxes of getting certain demographics, then I think that's realistic to make progress on. With demographics, I think it's harder to know. The gender, for example, has been, that's one that we've been tracking for longer, and that's held very steady overall in the EA community. It's been sort of 70% male since we started collecting data. So that's one where maybe, I hope that things will be more welcoming to women and non-binary people than they have been at times in the past. But whether we'll see numbers change, I'm less sure of that.
Okay, great. Well, so Julia will be having office hours at 11 o'clock in the Montague room. So if you have more questions for Julia, do feel free to come along then and ask them. But for now, please join me in thanking Julia Wise.